Do you understand what arousal is? Is arousal always a bad thing? Do you know how to cope with a dog that's over-aroused? Well, join me in today's episode of Lifting All Ships, where I'm going to talk about arousal, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Hi there everybody and welcome to today's episode of Lifting All Ships, where I'm going to be talking about arousal. So arousal seems to be a buzzword that is currently banding around in dog training circles, whether it be domestic dog training, sports training or other training, behaviour modification, whatever you want to talk about. And arousal seems to be the current word, the flavour of the month, and the issue of arousal being a negative thing. So for me, arousal is a term that we've attached to behaviour that we would describe as probably problematic, and we would see arousal as a negative, or certainly that's the inference from the manner in which people talk about arousal. They talk about over-aroused dog. Is your dog over-aroused? He's way too aroused. We need to incessantly calm him down. We need to make the dog have the dog in a calm state, and so forth and so forth. And really, the first thing we need to discuss about arousal is understanding what it is and what it looks like. So the most obvious, example, or the most complete study about arousal was the Yerkes-Dodson arousal curve, where they look specifically about arousal relating to performance and being able to do a task. And that's probably the best study, insight, and look at arousal and the pros and cons. And what they basically deduced was that arousal is a necessity in order for peak performance, but what we're looking for is the individual, whether it be dog or human, to be in the optimum state in the arousal. So the optimum level of arousal. So if we look at the arousal curve, which essentially has the lower end where the dog would be, in probably disengaged, disinterested, passive, dormant, however you want to describe it. And we look at the other end of the spectrum where the dog is barking, whining, it's moving a lot, it's frantic, and it's spinning, it's lunging. All those things would be the far end of the arousal curve. And what we're looking for is the dog to be in the middle, where they can be at their peak state of arousal for optimum performance. And when we're talking about arousal, and there's lots of documentation which talks about that study, and you can certainly go online and Google it, but I'm going to talk about it more about the causes of arousal and why we shouldn't be looking at it as a negative per se. So arousal definitely is indicative of the dog's training, its education, its breed type, but most importantly, it is often a reflection of the skill set, knowledge and expertise of the owner, handler, trainer in order to manage that dog's arousal. So you often find dog sports enthusiasts, they aspire to have the dog in a heightened state of arousal to get the dog in that optimum mindset for peak performance. Whether it's an agility dog, an obedience dog, an IGP dog, a field trials dog, whatever it is that we're competing in, we're always talking about getting the dog in drive, getting the dog excited, getting the dog motivated for it to complete the task that we're looking for it to do. Whether it's an agility dog, an obedience dog, as I said, we're looking for that dog to be in somewhat of an aroused state. So if the dog is passive and nonchalant and disinterested, they're not going to be able to perform at their best. They're going to be more aware of their environment. Some dogs can show a heightened arousal by appearing to be shut down, but actually they're frozen to the spot. So that's no use to us in terms of sports or performance, and certainly behaviour and living their best life. And the other end is when the dog is so overstimulated by the prospect of the task at hand that they're unable to think and therefore making mistakes because of their speed or their over-arousal and so forth and so forth. when it comes to domestic dogs, people often misunderstand that a excited dog is an aroused dog, and often that excited dog is just a dog that doesn't have enough education and direction. That's down to us as the trainer and the owner to educate them. What you find is a lot of people that talk about arousal in a negative, it's because the skill set that you need to effectively drive a Ferrari is often not, it takes time, it takes knowledge, it takes lots of practice to have that skill set to be able to drive that really, really high speed car in the fast lane of the Autobahn and do so accurately and negotiate through chicanes and cones and so forth and so forth. That would be the level of expertise that you see with a Formula One driver, somebody like Lewis Hamilton, for example. When you take that same vehicle and you take it on its local, say you take it to go and do your shopping, you're never going to see it flourish and do its best thing. However, if you saw somebody that was, an inexperienced driver but had loved the adrenaline, you're probably going to find that they're going to end up in an accident or damaging the vehicle or even worse. And that's the best comparison that I can say about handlers and owners that have dogs that are aroused. The first thing that we have to acknowledge is that we created dogs to have that could work or operate in an aroused state. And often that meant that they were able to do a task repetitively. They were also able to endure a level of discomfort or pain depending on what the task was. Say, for example, if the animal was, of the dog was a terrier group, which were essentially vermin, there to capture vermin or to take on, say, for example, bulls or livestock or cattle if they were herding breeds or some of the bull breeds, or if it was a gun dog, they have to go through thick bramble, go hunting. They have to be really focused for a protracted period of time, and it is definitely the case that we created or we sought after the dogs that had a high level of drive, desire, want to be able to complete those tasks. Often, as they were essentially a job and they had a vocation, they need to be able to complete that task repetitively, often several days in succession, months in succession, depending on what they were being asked to do, possibly day after day with little downtime, maybe, depending on the season. But those dogs had to have a huge amount of physical stamina, mental stamina, desire, and so forth, in order to be able to do that task and do it well. They would often have to endure the climate being challenging, whether it be rain, sleet, snow. The terrain sometimes would be challenging, and that means that would create an animal that had a lot of will and desire to perform a task and to do it repeatedly over and over and over again. And at one time that would have served us within our relationship with dogs. They were bred primarily as tools to help us in our daily work and our daily lives and to make our lives easier. And as a result of that, you don't want an employee that's not willing to come to work 24/7 if you need them to go up a hill and bring in the flock of sheep or to go and pick up the shot game or whatever the case may be. So the first thing is we need to acknowledge our part in creating these dogs that have desire, drive and want for specific tasks. And those tasks have essentially been modified from the predatory sequence, which is the hunting, the process of hunting, seeking, stalking, capturing, killing, etc. of prey or whatever it might be. And we've modified that to able to utilize it for our own ends. As a result of that, the dogs that were created, now a lot of them don't have the same need. Our society has evolved. We don't have, we have other means of, for example, gathering livestock, vermin extermination, guarding our properties. We have security devices, and a lot of these roles become redundant, and the need to have dogs that exhibited those traits often wasn't necessary. But however, we haven't necessarily modified the breeds and the dogs to remove those traits which were at one point useful and necessary to the relationship that we had with them. So often we'll find that a lot of dogs that are inverted commas, over aroused, they're merely exhibiting natural instinct and their traits that their breed is predisposed to, but they haven't been either provided with an alternative behaviour, an education of what to do as an alternative response in a situation where they may be triggered or provoked to act in a more natural manner. So if I give you a simple example, a border collie, for example, that hasn't got a flock of sheep, you need to provide it with a substitute for their desire to chase and herd. Often those border collies are very, very popular in sports, and that provides a sufficient outlet for those most primal needs. If those needs aren't met, i.e. that dog is not put in a home where it has an outlet for its mental energy and its physical energy, it's gonna the devil's gonna make work for idle hands, and as a result, those characteristics and desire can come out in a negative way, which can be perceived as an over-aroused dog. For example, you walk it down the high street and they see fast-moving cars, which invokes them to want to chase, and that dog is then deemed as over-aroused. Actually, it's a dog that hasn't had its needs met. So that's the first thing that we need to take responsibility for. Second thing is we need to give our dogs prerequisite skills. We need to teach them how to navigate the world in which we live in, where our relationship has largely evolved. And yes, again, as I said earlier, we haven't modified the dogs in accordance with that progression or change in our relationship. So, for example, the dogs that at one point were exterminators or guarders, we need to now let them know that actually we don't need you to perform that task anymore. And when you see something fast in front of you and moving, you want to run after it and chase it and capture it, or to guard and bark at it, we no longer need you to do that, but what we need you to do is an alternative response. So those things should all be prerequisite behaviours, standard things that we teach our dogs. A recall, impulse control, focus and engagement with us, loosely walking, ignoring distractions, all those things that allow our dogs to live in a very non-doggy world where everything around them is drawing them, which can often create over-arousal issues. When we're talking about prerequisite behaviours, certainly for those of you that are listening and that partake in sports, you need to constantly think about the idea or concept of training two dogs simultaneously. The dog that you want to live with and you want to have in your home and you want to take to a coffee shop and you want to take into public spaces, and secondly, the dog that you want to compete with. And often what you will find is that the dogs that do well in one area need more education in the other area. And the dog that can seamlessly go from one to t'other is somewhat of a golden unicorn, so to speak. You'll often get a dog that might be easy to live with, but might not necessarily be easy to train, or might need more motivation and building of desire and want. Whereas the dog that has those things, you might experience some behavioural challenges which you need to put more input into, which is where the issues of arousal and over-arousal may manifest itself. So often what happens when people get sports-bred dogs, they have the dog that wants to play the game. They have the dog that wants to chase the thing. They have the dog that wants to work incessantly. They have a really bright dog. They have all those attributes that will make it easier for that dog to train and succeed and excel at a particular sport, especially if they're from that lineage. However, where the majority of work may be needed is teaching them to navigate really normal behaviours. For example, the German Shepherd or the Guardy breed that's got a genetic predisposition to IGP or a bite work sport. I don't want you to bark at anything that moves, and I don't want you to bark at the mailman every time he comes or whenever people pass my door, or I don't need to be guarding in this particular scenario. For example, if I'm walking down the high street and somebody puts their umbrella up, I don't need you to be hyper vigilant. Those are things that we need to understand as a byproduct of their genetics, and we need to ensure that we're putting in groundwork to teach them those scenarios are perfectly normal. They need to accept them and they need to understand them. So think about training those two dogs simultaneously. The dog that you want to live with and the dog that you want to train. As I said, the dogs that are predisposed to training, the emphasis is going to be on things like settling in the home, having an off switch, relaxing, being indifferent to triggers that might normally invoke some sort of response. And therefore, we can create the picture of the dog that isn't aroused, but understands where it's appropriate to show that heightened state of arousal, i.e. in the context of sport. So that's the first thing. Think about those prerequisite behaviours. those foundation skills that you're going to teach your dog. Also to think about training the two dogs simultaneously so that you are aware of the need to balance those things out. When your dog is learning and when it's being trained, there's going to be times when one part of one of those personas is going to take precedence. So in adolescence, you're going to put more emphasis into your life skills, and you're probably going to take your sports skills are going to take a back seater because of the dog going through some hormonal changes, some physical development. And when they're a little bit older, you can put more emphasis on their sports skills, and you can probably hopefully by then you're gleaning the benefit of putting all that good work into your domestic life skills, and therefore you're going to be able to really progress their sports training. And those things are constantly in conflict with each other, and it's important to constantly balance them out. Another area that really can affect dogs that are over-aroused, or the label of over-arousal being attached to a dog, is the handler skill set. So coming back to my original analogy about the Ferrari and being able to drive a Ferrari, it's really important that you are constantly reviewing, evaluating, and upskilling yourself when you have a dog that is predisposed to being over-aroused and excited. Those dogs can bring a lot of joy to training. They're ever ready, they ever want to engage, and will train indefinitely. But being able to navigate them learning, them having self-control, being consistent with criteria, your timing, your handler mechanics are going to be critical for that dog being clear of what you want of them, and also about the dog not showing signs of frustration, barking, whining, hyperactive movement, frenzied movement, frantic movement, and so forth and so forth. It's really important that you understand your role in the training process and you work on your mechanics. A huge thing to do is to invest in a smartphone or some sort of recording device so that you can continually reflect on your training, and you're being aware of those tiny little details that can make a difference between the dog seeing a certain picture and thinking one thing, and seeing that same picture and feeling and responding in another way. And it's really important that you are critical of your training constantly, and that you are always aware of those nuances that are going to make a difference. Whether you throw a treat versus feed the dog in position, whether you click the dog and reward it with a toy, or click the dog and reward it with food. And those things are going to make a massive difference to dogs that are predisposed to being over-aroused. So as a trainer, I utilize reward-specific markers and location-specific markers, and they help my dogs that are predisposed to being over-aroused to have clarity. So if I give you a little example of my giant schnauzer, he's been a dog that is incredibly aroused and incredibly driven at anything that he does. He loves to train, he loves to walk, he loves to do anything with me. And that often can be a joy, but sometimes it can be frustrating for him and I when we're trying to do something that requires him to be more thoughtful and poised. So my antidote, or my answer to him, is to create clarity for the dog by using reward-specific markers. Markers and marker signals that say to him whether he's going to be fed or whether he's going to be receiving a toy, and more specifically how that reinforcement is going to be given to him, i.e. in position or in motion, which for him would be very, very different in terms of his response. One would cause him to be thoughtful and pensive, the other would instantly create excitement and make him really, really aroused, and therefore I have to teach him to regulate himself. So as he's learning and becomes more proficient in his understanding, and when I see that he understands a particular skill, I will deliberately cause him to be a bit aroused and excited, and then ask him to repeat the behaviour and straight away go back and use my reward marker, that means I'm going to feed him in position, to teach him to self-regulate. So he understands how to switch and bring himself back to being really, really excited, to being more thoughtful and still. And that's something that you need to educate dogs that are predisposed to being aroused, and that are likely to get aroused just at the prospect of training, or get easily aroused. But it's really critical that when you do this, you are meticulous in your training, your timing, your mechanics, your criteria, all has to be really, really clear to the dog in order for them to be black and white and sure, and therefore confident about what you're asking of them. The other thing to incorporate into your training is teaching them to think whilst in a heightened state of arousal. This would be done, again, with very simple behaviours that they understand and they've been taught, using the process of reward-specific markers and location-specific markers, and then creating arousal and asking the dog to do behaviours that require stillness, and behaviors that require specific movement, and the dog has arousal or to the temptation of arousal or triggers that might cause arousal to be present. So for example, I might ask my dog to sit on a platform and be really still, and I might do so with toys being thrown or as I'm running past the items, so that he has to ignore his desire to chase, which will create arousal, and he has to remain perfectly still. Alternatively, I can get him to pay me attention as I'm moving, and I can do that by throwing toys around, which might create arousal, or distracting him with toys, moving toys, so he understands to remain engaged and focused and move. Again, that's two things at once: remain being attentive and move forward, whilst there is triggers around that could increase his arousal. So those little layers are going to ultimately help him to be able to function even when he's excited, no matter how aroused he is, to still listen to my words. The other thing to incorporate is shaping, and using shaping to teach the dog to work through frustration or when they get aroused. One of the things that I like to do with my dogs that are predisposed to being aroused is teach them a consistent behaviour, like getting in a large box. Over time, depending on the size of the dog and the size of the puppy, I will decrease the size of the box, where it will at some point get frustrating or challenging for the dog to put its whole body in that box. This will cause the dog to be a little bit aroused, because they want to complete the behaviour, but there's a level of difficulty, and I will allow them the space and the time to work out how to put their body in that on that item, and ultimately leading to them getting the higher value reinforcer. So the dog is being taught how to channel its drive and that heightened state of arousal into a more thoughtful behaviour, and ultimately leading them to get the higher value reinforcement. So teaching them how to function even though they are really, really excited and overstimulated. A huge cause of arousal is the environment and everything within it. And how big the conversation about arousal, that could be a whole podcast in itself, but everything within that environment. It could be other dogs, it could be people, it could be the surface, it could be things within the environment, it could be smells, it could be sounds, and so forth and so forth. You need to be aware of how those individual triggers affect your dog's arousal. So for example, if you have an adolescent dog, other dogs are going to be very much a pull for them, and that's going to cause their arousal to be higher or possibly lower depending on the dog's character, and that would be definitely affecting their arousal state. So it's then taking that out of the context of sports or life skills and working on their confidence around other dogs, so that they are able to feel safe, secure, and indifferent to those other dogs in their environment. Not dealing with that issue will then cause the dog to manifest their concern, their apprehension, or their tension within the work, and it will appear as if the dog's aroused within the context of work, but actually the dog is being overstimulated by the other dog or the scent of another dog and so forth. So divide and conquer. Always think about what the dog is actually feeling and its response, and deal with that emotion as opposed to the behaviour that is eroded or affected because of the way the dog is feeling. If your dog is concerned about the man with the big hat, don't ask it to do a sit to counteract that behaviour. Get the dog confident about people in the hat. Now that doesn't mean to say that you can't use the dog's excitement or pre-learnt behaviour. For example, if they really love to do hand touches, you could use that to build their confidence around people with hats by doing hand touches near the person and playing with them and engaging with them, so that they pair that presence of the person, for example, with a scary hat, with something that they enjoy doing. And that is really about the timing of when that happens. You would want the person to predict the sight of the person with the big hat, for example, to predict that their fun thing is going to happen. And it has to be something that causes them to be really, really aroused. So that's where arousal can actually work for you. If you have a dog that's a bit concerned or timid, if you can shift its arousal from being under-aroused to almost over-aroused, borderline over-aroused, they're not going to be so aware of the thing that concerns them. So we can actually use arousal or over-arousal in our favour if our dog is concerned about things. Now separately, we want to reduce the trigger or put it further away so that we can do some great foundation training of building up their confidence from afar, so that they can learn to acclimatize or desensitize or counter condition their feeling towards or their perception of that scary thing, so then putting the whole thing back together. So we can use arousal for us in conjunction with teaching the dog a different behavior or feeling or emotion towards the thing that they were previously concerned about. So just some thoughts there about arousal and it not necessarily being a bad thing. There is going to be places where arousal can actually work for you. If you have a dog that's concerned about them, get their arousal up so that they're not so aware of the thing that's concerning them. Whether it be noise, whether it be sights, whether it be sound. If you can find something that causes them to not be aware of that situation, you can use that to build their confidence. Now that's a starting point. Over time, you definitely want to divide that up, and you want to work on counter conditioning and getting the dog to be desensitized by increasing the distance away from the trigger. However, if you're in a situation where that's unavoidable, certainly behavior modification, I would strongly advise people to use something that causes the dog to be so fixated on that item or food that you can navigate the other dog barking at them or the person approaching them, until you can set up situations where you can introduce the trigger at a greater distance or toning it down so that you can work on the dog's confidence. Arousal isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's how you use it. It's the skill set of the owner and the teaching that we give our dogs to function in a heightened state of arousal so they can learn to be at their peak level of performance and still function and listen to our cues and respond to us. Remember, arousal isn't a bad thing. It's how you use it, and remember to learn how to drive your Ferrari in the fast lane, I should say. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode of Lifting All Ships talking about arousal. If you have, then click like and subscribe so you never miss another episode, and you can support this podcast. Feel free to share it far and wide. And from me, take care, enjoy your dogs, and have fun.